Hey everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for class for Wednesday, the 22nd, where I'm putting some closure onto Much Ado About Nothing. You'll notice the due dates below that our journal on Much Ado About Nothing will be due today, if you're watching this on the 22nd, Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And again, I will evaluate those informally for content, return them back to you via email, and that might help to give you some direction for your first paper, which I gave an extension on, so that'll be due on the 3rd of April, which is a Monday, also by 11:59 p.m., also via PDF to my email. And in terms of Much Ado About Nothing, we were talking about some quotes. In Act 1, Scene 1, line 63, they talk about the skirmishes of wit, and there's a merry war between them. And certainly we will see upcoming plays that talk about war, but this is a much more lighthearted war because we are talking about comedies after all. One of the scenes that I wanted to draw your attention to is Act 1, Scene 1, line 160. I had mentioned this a little bit before when Claudio is seeking Benedict's approval, and it's so important to him that ultimately Benedict approve of Hero, which again sort of illustrates that Claudio is less interested in Hero herself and more interested in the idea that she be a proper match. So I suggested last class, it's the perfect timing for Claudio. He's just returned back from war. Hero is beautiful and available, and she also happens to be the only heir, which means that she comes with the family dowry. And when Claudio and Benedict are talking to one another, and Benedict asks, is she not a modest lady? And Benedict says, do not question me as an honest man should do for my true simple judgment. Or would you have me speak after my custom as being a professed tyrant to their sex? Claudio says, no, I pray thee speak in sober judgment. And Benedict says, why in faith, methinks she's too low for a high praise, too brown for fair praise, too little for a great praise. Only this commendation I can afford her, that were she other than she is, she were unhandsome, and being no other but as she is, I do not like her. And of course, this is a very convoluted way of saying that, yes, he approves. And Claudio responds, thou thinkest I am in sport, I pray thee. Tell me truly how thou likest her. And Benedict says, would you buy her that you inquire after her? And Claudio says dreamily, can the world buy such a jewel? And Benedict, in a cynical way, says, yeah, and a case to put it into. And of course, as they go on and reference to Leonardo's short daughter, we've had references to the idea of height in Midsummer. Dark daughter references to being a brunette as opposed to being a blonde. This is a theme that we also saw in the sonnets as well. So we're beginning to see some repetition. So we continue on with the play. You know, some of the best parts of the play are when characters reveal their inner selves. So in Act 1, for instance, and this happens to be Scene 1, around line 296 or so, Claudio is saying, I looked upon her, he's talking about Hero, with a soldier's eye, that liked but had a rougher task in hand than to drive liking to the name of love. But now I am returned, and that war thoughts have left their places vacant, and their rooms come thronging soft and delicate desires, all promising me how fair young Hero is, saying I liked her ere I went to the wars. And, of course, Don Pedro offers his assistance, and this is how we get the first misunderstanding. But the character who gives us his true self is the most unappealing character of all, and that happens to be Don John the Bastard, who is a literal and, of course, a figurative bastard as he goes through the play trying to create a bunch of havoc and a bunch of pain and despair. While the play also gives us commentary about love. One of my favorites is in Act 2, Scene 1. And this is around line 70 or so. And this is when Leonardo and Beatrice are speaking. And Beatrice talks about, in her perception, the reality of love. The fault will be in the music, cousin, if you not be wooed in good time. If the prince be too important, tell him there is measure in everything. And so dance out the answer. For hear me, hero, wooing, wedding, and repenting is as a Scotch jig, a measure, a sync pace. The first suit is hot and hasty, like a Scotch jig. The second, full as fantastical. The wedding, mannerly modest. And a measure full of state and ancientry. And then comes repentance. And with his bad legs fall into the sync pace faster and faster till he sink into his grave. And of course, the idea of all of the stages of love, from the beginning of being completely enamored to the end to experiencing regret. But we know this is a comedy, so that ultimately our happy ending is supposed to presuppose that there will be a happily ever after for these couples. Even Hero and Claudio, again, I had indicated how difficult it is for contemporary audiences to accept that Hero would be so forgiving. I mean, she basically stands by Claudio. And that said, regardless of what happens with Hero and Claudio, the couple we're most interested in, and Shakespeare would be well aware of this, is Beatrice and Benedict, that merry war of wit between them. And they illustrate a more true kind of love, one that's not based on convenience, one that is more based on connection. And that said, I love how Benedict is so not only easily convinced to love Beatrice, Act 2, Scene 3, line 220 or so, but it's justification when he says, this can be no trick. The conference was sadly born. They have the truth of this from Hero. They seem to pity the lady. It seems her affections have their full bent. Love me? Why, it must be requited. I hear how I am censured. They say I will beat myself proudly if I perceive the love come from her. They say, too, that she would rather die than give any sign of affection. I never did think to marry, but I must not seem proud. Happy are they that hear their detractors and put them to mending. They say the lady is fair, 'tis a truth, I can bear them witness, and virtuous, 'tis so, I cannot reprove it, and wise, but for loving me. And by my troth, it is no addition to her wit, nor no great argument of her folly, for I will be horribly in love with her. I may chance have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken on me, because I have railed so long against marriage. But doth not the appetite alter? A man loves the meat in his youth, that he cannot endure in his age. Shall quibs and sentences and these paper bullets of the brain awe a man from the career of his humor? No, the world must be peopled. So what a rationale for accepting Beatrice. He has a responsibility to people the world. If that's not an arrogant Benedict, then I don't know what is. Of course, we know how Beatrice is able to manipulate that arrogance to her advantage when she convinces Benedict to to avenge the wrongs that have been done against Hero by basically pursuing Claudio. And this is where Beatrice gives in Act 4, Scene 3, line 303, her very famous speech, "Oh, if I were a man." Whether or not this is true, the idea that she can't take action because she's a female, or she's very clever and she knows that this is the way that she can ultimately convince Claudio to take action for her so that she doesn't have to get her hands dirty. Keep this in mind when we start talking about Macbeth, particularly Lady Macbeth, and some of her motivations and perhaps some of her techniques to get Macbeth to act for her. But certainly, I think that if nothing else, just thinking about how this is much ado about nothing because it's trivial, but it also is about noting, which would have been pronounced very similar to nothing, and also was a slang term for female genitalia. Typical Shakespeare to put in a barb in there and a sexual innuendo if possible. So we get this happy ending, again, maybe with a question mark, and then all the couples are together, regardless of how Claudio has treated Hero. Claudio is not killed, of course, no death. Hero's honor has been restored, which is important for her being seen as worthwhile for marriage. And Don John will be punished after the play proper so that we can end on a festive note. So those are the two comedies that I had assigned for us, and certainly there are many other comedies, but I wanted to move ahead to another genre, which is what we will be doing over the next several classes, and talk about Shakespeare's history plays. We think the history plays were mostly written after the comedies, and they are loosely based on English history, hence they are known as history plays. Specifically, the history book of the time, the definitive history book of the time, was the Chronicles of Holinshed. So what Shakespeare would have done is use those stories. However, he would have adapted them for dramatic purposes. So yes, it is useful to know the history when you are reading the history plays, but it can also be frustrating because if you're a purist, then you know that the plays aren't necessarily accurately following the true history, because in the end, these history plays are fiction. And they're also chronicle plays. Quite interestingly, all of these plays, they stand as independent units, but you can put them all together and they tell a much larger story. The first in the chronology is Richard II, about a medieval king, and that's where we are going to be beginning. And these were plays that offered the audience an opportunity to be patriotic, to celebrate their British past. It was also an opportunity to give political commentary. And if you'll remember, we had talked about at the beginning of the semester how dangerous it was for playwrights to make political commentary. They could make sexual commentary. They could certainly make violent episodes, but being too political could land someone in a great deal of trouble and even possible execution. That's not to say Shakespeare wasn't political. He was just clever about his political statements. And one of the most clever things he did was embed his political statements within these history plays that occurred in the past. The fact that they have parallels to the present, or Shakespeare's present, he could just shrug and say, well, that's just a coincidence, but that was not my intent. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Of course, that was his intent. And we'll see this very deliberately with Richard II because it happens to be a play about who has the ability to rule. And should it be someone who has birthright? According to the chain of being, if you'll remember, there is a hierarchy and everything has an established place in society, and at the top of the hierarchy in the human world would be the king and the queen. They would be considered to be God's mouthpiece, and ultimately birthright determines that. It's still the case in England, actually. Certainly it's not necessarily as stringent as it used to be in the past. Nevertheless, what we've got is a play that asks us to question whether or not birthright is really the best way to determine kingship, particularly if someone doesn't have the capabilities or the temperament to rule, even though they might have the birthright. And would somebody who has a better temperament and better capabilities be a better suited person to rule, even though they don't necessarily have that direct lineage to royalty? This is one of the central questions we're going to get between our two main characters in Richard II and Bolingbroke. Now, I can tell you that right now, you should expect some huge differences in tone. These are not the comedies. These will be very dark. These will be very complex. There will be death. We will have many characters that will oftentimes have multiple names. So sometimes they will be referred to by their surname, sometimes referred to by their first name, sometimes referred to by their title, sometimes referred to by their nickname. So it can be very difficult to keep all of these characters straight. I've always talked about the importance of performance with watching a Shakespearean drama, that ultimately the plays were meant to be performed, not read, but especially for something like a history play, because they are known to be some of Shakespeare's most complex works. If I had to identify a point in the class that perhaps is the peak of complexity, it would be this one. If you like political intrigue and shifting alliances, you're going to like this play. If you're not very political, try to connect it to some of the political tensions in our own world. And I think what you'll end up seeing are a good amount of parallels, because after all, Shakespeare is about timeless and universal themes. The history of Richard II is that Richard II, the true history, was a boy king in the medieval period. That meant that the adult relatives, basically his court was filled with relatives, because ultimately it would be the royal family, everybody who would be related to one another who would be in rule. The adults basically ruled until Richard came of age. And ultimately, we know from the history that there were accusations of Richard, the boy king, who's now the adult king, abusing his power. And ultimately, he was overthrown by Bolingbroke, someone who is related to Richard, because we've got family members. Everyone is an uncle or a cousin. But that said, Bolingbroke doesn't have the direct connection to the kingly lineage that Richard II would have. Again, as I indicated, Shakespeare plays a little fast and loose with some of the historical data. So King Richard in Shakespeare's play is much more inept and much more corrupt than anything that history would show. And Bolingbroke is much more of an enigma. What we oftentimes see are characters who are performing, literally and figuratively, which might be the case in the political world, that what you say to the masses, to the populace, may not necessarily reflect the truth, may not necessarily reflect what you say behind closed doors, or may not necessarily reflect what you think to yourself. And in that way, you have to consider this play in terms of how much can we trust any of these characters and what they say and what they do. This play has perhaps some of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. There is a lot of dialogue and not much action. A couple reasons for this. It's not particularly easy to stage things like action. So it's easier to talk about, let's say, a war than to actually engage in a war. Part of it is Richard's temperament. He spends a lot of time talking and whining, as we will see, and feeling pity for himself, as we will see, rather than actually taking action. In fact, he's better suited as a poet, probably, than a ruler. And again, some of the Shakespeare's most famous speeches, some of his most beautiful poetry exists in Richard II. Now, in terms of productions, because this play is somewhat challenging, what I wanted us to watch would be a production from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company. And basically, they're known for doing literary adaptations in Britain on television. But they undertook quite the project in the 1970s by trying to put all of Shakespeare's plays, all 30 plus plays, on film, not only in their entirety, but as accurately as possible. So these are the closest productions that you're going to be able to get in terms of Shakespeare's writing. There will be very few changes. Now, that said, I thought that watching this kind of production for Richard II would be particularly useful. It's probably more dry and more British than what we've seen thus far. But in terms of language and understanding plot, again, you're going to basically get the play itself. I do caution, as I always do, that watching a play is never a substitute for reading the play. But do understand that when you're watching a BBC version, when you put on the closed captioning, you're basically reading Shakespeare's play. But that's not to in any way negate that after you've watched this performance, you should read the play. I'm also well aware you're writing a paper. So, that said, I thought watching the performance would be useful as you are in the midst of writing a paper. As you know, everybody has the option, once they've submitted in their paper, of doing a revision after I've returned the paper to you. I just ask that you incorporate my comments into your revision and that you submit, along with your revision, the original paper that you submitted with my comments so I can compare and contrast, and you would get the higher of the two grades. And if you need additional feedback or direction, I can happily meet with you and I can guide you. And you would have until the ending of the semester to do that, but obviously the sooner the better that you hand in your revision. Now, the idea behind this paper that's coming up is that this is the paper that teaches us how to write a paper about Shakespeare. So your second paper, which will be due at the very, very ending of the semester, some of your options will be to write on either Richard II, which we've just started now, or our two upcoming tragedies. That happens to be Macbeth or Othello. And since it's due at the very ending of the semester, you wouldn't have time to do a revision. That said, occasionally I will have a student that hands in something early enough so that we can negotiate a revision, but it's not guaranteed the way it is with the first paper. The idea is that you wouldn't need it because the first paper is the learning exercise, so you can just put into practice what you've learned with the second paper, just with a different drama. And that said, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below because they're examples about quoting from Shakespeare, since, as you know, in your critical analysis paper, I'm not asking you to do any outside research, but certainly you need to quote from the texts themselves in order to be able to support your arguments. And the good news about quoting from Shakespeare, as we've seen, is that we don't have to rely on page numbers. I can direct you to an act, a scene, and the line, so that ultimately, regardless of the edition you're using, you can find your place. So in the parenthetical documentation, the parentheses that occur after the quotation, this is where you would put act, scene, and line. And I wanted to give you a visual of what that would look like. So obviously, if you're just quoting a word or two, you don't need to document that. So the example here is Hamlet speaks of himself as, quote, dull and muddy-middled rascal, unquote, a, quote, coward, unquote, a, quote, villain, unquote, and an, unquote, ass, and a, quote, ass, unquote. You might notice that theme that Shakespeare likes to use asses. It was something Dogberry talked about. It was something Bottom talked about. So that ultimately, if it's just a word or two, you don't need to document. But if you are going to document, then in the parentheses, immediately after the quote, and it doesn't matter whether you have finished your sentence or not, then you would put act, period, scene, period, and then lines in numerals. So you can see the example. Hamlet's conception of the world reveals itself early in the first soliloquy. Quote, "'Tis an unweeded garden, that grows to seed," unquote. And then in parentheses, you've got the one and the period. That's for Act 1. The 2, and that's in lowercase, and the period. That's for Scene 2. And then the 135 through 36, the numbers, and that indicates the line numbers. Whenever you see a slash in a piece of poetry or in a quotation, that means that that's a break from one line of poetry to another. And of course, if you happen to be quoting something that's longer, you might need to separate that from the body of the text. We call that a block quote. Usually if you're quoting over 3 lines is when we separate it off and we don't incorporate it into the text. And the example that you're given in the notes below is that Hamlet begins his first soliloquy with a wish for self-destruction. And then you can see that rather than writing to the ending of the margin on the paper, I've just basically copied the speech in the way that it appears. So each line is devoted to each line of poetry. Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Note that the punctuation comes first and then the parenthetical documentation when we're using block quotes. And in the parenthetical documentation, you can see that's from Act 1, Scene 2, line 129 to 32. And you do not use quotation marks with block quotes. It's considered redundant. So when you're blocking off a quote, you're already letting the reader know that you are quoting, so you don't need to use quote marks. If you're going to leave out a large piece of text, you can use not just an ellipsis, the 3 periods, but if you're going to leave out several lines, you could just use an entire line of dots, as you see in the example below. Hamlet reflects upon the temptation to destroy himself, as when he wonders, who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And then we've got a line of just the dots or the ellipses, when he himself might his quietest make with a bare bodkin. And again, we have Act 3, Scene 1, 69, 74 through 5. So that means our first line is line 69, and then we've skipped to line 74 through 5. So that's another option for you in terms of how you could go about documenting quotes. So Hamlet again chastises himself in the soliloquy following the player's speech. Quote, "Oh, what a peasant slave am I," unquote. And again, in parentheses, Act 2, Scene 2, 550. So you don't have to write page or PG or line or anything like that. If you're going to quote prose, not verse, not poetry, but you're going to quote lines of prose, then you can see how that would be done. World weariness overtakes Hamlet in his remarks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And then we've got the quote, and that goes on for 3 lines because it's not long enough to really need a block quote. "I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition, that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory." And in the parentheses, again, we have our documentation. Act 2, Scene 2, line 295 through 99. So those are some visual representations of what quotation looks like. You can see in this example of the quote, there are uses of ellipses. In other words, that a word or several words were deleted in that original quote, not because you want to change the meaning of the quote, but purely because you the words that you're deleting don't add any real value or content to what it is that you're saying. Generally speaking, use an ellipsis only when omitting something from the middle of a passage. So you don't have to do it from the beginning of the quote or the ending of the quote, because the assumption is that basically lots of material comes before a quote, lots of material comes after a quote. And again, this is pretty much a review of the MLA, Modern Language Association System, but since Shakespeare is divided by act, scene, and line, there are a few differences. But outside of that, it's very similar to what you've done in your previous English classes, including using square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets, if you are going to insert your own language into a quote, which you would do not to comment on the quote. You can always comment on the quote beginning or after that, but you would do that ultimately because you needed to clarify something. Oftentimes a pronoun, it could be a pronoun like he, and based on the quote that you selected, it's unclear whether the he is in reference to, let's say, Claudio or Benedict. So after the pronoun he in square brackets, you might add the name Claudio, which did not appear in the original quote, but that would help the reader have some clarity about who the he is referencing. So basically, what's left is our discussion form question, because I wanted you to spend some time working on your paper. That'll be due on Friday the 24th by 8 a.m. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. What comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, did you prefer and why? Which of the 2 comedies that we read did you prefer and why? And as you can see, I'm asking questions that don't necessarily have a right or a wrong answer. I'm really more interested in your reasoning. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, though I encourage you to, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn so that you can get an idea of what it is that we would have talked about in class. So next class, I will provide you with the BBC link to Richard II so that we can begin watching production. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.